Sarah Mendelson has worked for nearly 2 decades on a wide range of human rights and democracy issues. She's currently the Deputy Assistant Administrator in USAID's Bureau for Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance. Previously, she was Director of the Human Rights and Security Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and before that, she was a Professor of International Politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Earlier in her career, she was a program officer in Moscow with the National Democratic Institute. And before joining the Obama administration in 2010, she served on the advisory committee for the Europe and Central Asia Division of Human Rights Watch. Okay, Sarah, take it away.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. I'm a huge fan and supporter of Human Rights First, so it's a real honor. I am joined today by a fantastic panel. Before I introduce the people who are sitting with me, let's just be very clear who's not sitting with us. Unfortunately, Igor Kochetkov did not come. Igor met with President Obama a few weeks ago in September in Russia. Igor is from an LGBT group in St. Petersburg and felt that the threats to his organization were too acute right now. There is some who feel that the situation in Ukraine, which 9 years ago completely terrified the authorities, is again making the authorities in Russia quite nervous. So it is with deep regret that we do not have our colleague with him, but we will try and represent the situation that's going on in Russia as best we can. We do have, however, representatives from several fantastic organizations and countries that are experiencing what I call closing space, the shrinking of public political space. On my right, I have Yelem from the Ethiopian, from the Human Rights Defenders organization that works on Ethiopia. I've got Mina Kai, who is known to many of you from the UN Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Peaceful Assembly and Association. And I've got Nadine Mahab from the Cairo Institute for Human Rights. Before I ask a provocative question, and let's be clear that the title of this panel is How Can the United States Best Support Frontline Activists? And by United States, I think the conveners of the panel mean the United States government, but I think we can also open it up to US citizens. I want to note that we're here at a time when there's obviously an open revolution. There's technology that is enabling citizens to have more power and ask more of their governments than ever before. That, in part, has also triggered a backlash among authoritarians as sovereignty has shrunk, and it's making lots of people nervous. So we have both opportunities and challenges. The ability to connect like never before is certainly an opportunity. But we absolutely have an epidemic, a tipping point. There's all sorts of analogies that you could think of, but from just 9 years ago when we saw this pernicious NGO law in one country in Russia, it's really expanded. And every single day, even in countries that are actually quite open, you see laws that have embedded in them ways in which they're trying to shrink political space. So let's go one round first with an answer to the question that's before us about what more the United States can do. But I want us to also think really strategically about what your colleagues can do, what civil society can do. After we go one round, I'm gonna hear from you what you think the U.S. can do, and I'm gonna share a little bit what we are actually doing. But why don't we start with you, Nadine?
Thank you. First, I wanted to thank Human Rights First. They're going first with civil society. I think having organizations like Human Rights First and other organizations really support us when the voice and the space is silencing is very, very important. So as individuals, what you can do, even if you're part of the US government, is continuing to have these conversations is one of the ways that you protect human rights defenders on the front lines. When you see, for example, very famous people like Ala Abdel Fattah and Mona Saif being arrested and detained and dumped on the side of the highway, what keeps them safe is this attention and eye on it and the focus on human rights in these areas. So for me, what I think, I'm not of the mind that I'm here to tell the US government what to do. I'm of the mind of saying what is happening that's wrong is that while there are areas where the US government, and in fact all governments, talk a good game, there is no living up to that. When funding that goes to the military continues to go to the weapons that attack and create human rights violations, like tear gas and bullets, but you hold the F-16s, the message that's going to these governments and going to human rights offenders that human rights is not important. And that's not the message we want to cross. I'm not saying one way or the other. I have no opinion, public opinion, on the funding here, but that's not the message when we're holding back funding because of human rights violations. But the weapons that are allowed in because counterterrorism has become so important, that is an issue. So I think one of the things that the US really needs to do is look at its counterterrorism narrative, look at how security is thought of within a domestic policy and international policy, and see whether security and stability is human rights or security and stability is guns and more weapons and creating more enemies. To me, that is the most important idea or issue that I'd like to bring up to the US government. Other than that, it's up to the government to decide.
That was excellent, crisp. Mina?
Well, I'll be a bit more presumptuous than my colleague, and actually say some things that I think the U.S. government should do. But first, let me thank Human Rights First for inviting me, and actually the U.S. government for its support of my mandate. And as some of you know, the mandate that I hold was sponsored by the U.S., and I've had some pretty good relationships with the U.S. government on the work that I do, and a lot of support in terms of moving some of the resolutions. Let me say that just a few things on this. First of all, I think the major thing is consistency that we would like from the U.S. government, and taking a consistent approach to human rights. When violations and when defenders are affected anywhere in the world, they should be treated the same way. It's very difficult to understand how why the U.S. government treats Ethiopia and when it attacks human rights defenders differently from how the U.S. treats Zimbabwe, or how U.S. treats Egypt as opposed to Bahrain. And I think once you start seeing these differences, they send a message across the world that actually the U.S. wants to pick and choose where it wants to defend human rights defenders and what's right and what's wrong. I think that consistency is crucial. The second thing as well is that I think the U.S. government should not, I think Ethiopia for me is a very important issue around the funding and defenders issue. In 2009, Ethiopia passed a law that limited foreign funding to NGOs that do governance, corruption, women's rights, children's rights to 10% alone. Now, not only did the world do nothing, they actually rewarded Ethiopia. And now what we're seeing is that same law is now being suggested in Kenya, where I'm from, and let me also say that aside from being the UN Special Rapporteur, I am a human rights defender myself in Kenya. And we have got the challenge, even though now it's been suspended for a while, we've got the challenge of the same law as passed in Ethiopia coming through. It's also in South Sudan, and I can bet you that if this goes through, it will cut across the whole of the Horn of Africa and East Africa like a fire. It's important that the US does the right thing at the right moment, rather than wait and then reward Ethiopia. As we know, Ethiopia is one of the biggest recipients of US support and US funding in very many ways. And the other thing I think for me is also the question of sectoral equity. We have to move this issue of foreign funding a little bit forward. And I think one of the things we don't do well enough, all of us now, this is not about the US government, is that we have accepted across the world that globalization is a reality in our lives. Foreign capital can move across borders, can go anywhere. So we've got foreign companies and local companies receiving a lot of assistance in terms of investment and capital across the world. But then all of a sudden, when it comes to human rights groups or comes to or comes to NGOs, there is a problem. So we've got to have the same standard. If foreign companies can receive foreign investment, then surely we must have the same approach to all these issues. I also, just the last thing, because I think we want to keep this thing going and moving. One of the things that I would like to see the US doing better is using the UN mechanisms more than it has. And I think it's done well in the Human Rights Council. I think it could do better within the UN General Assembly and take a much more proactive role. And part of it for me is move the language around all these issues away from politics, away from strategic interests, into the framework of human rights. It's a fantastic framework that exists now. Let's take a human rights-based approach to development itself, so that it's not just funding the mosquito nets in Africa and the boreholes in Asia. Let's move this a little bit more into what's a human rights-based framework that can assist development, and that must necessarily include respect for political and civil rights. And that once we do that, I think we're better. And within that context as well, I think the US has been on a surge the last few years in creating these new multilateral organizations, open governance partnership, the Community of Democracies. I wish they could be brought into the UN mechanism, into the UN structure a little better, so that just as we have the Organization of Islamic States at the UN making a statement on behalf of the OIC, why can't the Community of Democracies make a statement on behalf of the Community of Democracies? That would add a lot of value to a lot of the things and the debates that are going on at the UN. And let me just say, as I conclude this part, I recognize the UN Permanent Rep in Geneva, who I met a few times, and I'm happy to see you here. It's very good to see you. Thanks. And may I also say something, last thing. My daughter is here. I haven't seen her for a few months, and she came to college here. And nice to see you, Ajwa. Thank you for coming.
Fabulous.
Yeah. US supporting a despotic government like the Ethiopian government is essentially creating destabilization in the Horn of Africa and Ethiopia. This law Maina has just talked about is just an assault on freedom of association, on people's human rights in violation of Ethiopia's own international obligation and its own constitution. The funding, the 10% funding that is limiting local Ethiopian human rights organization is, I think it's just a rhetoric, because the government itself is receiving to the tune of 30 to 40% of its budget from foreign sources. So I think this law is just an assault. It has already created a devastating effect within the 3 years that it has now become into effect from 2009. There are already organizations that has closed down. For example, the Ethiopian Mathematics and Physics Society has closed recently. How does a country benefit by closing down physics and mathematics society? By barring them from registration, restricting them from getting funding. One of the prominent human rights organization that was formed in 1991, the Ethiopian Human Rights Council, has already been operating 10%. Now, 85% of its staff has been laid off after the introduction of this law, and its bank account has been frozen, and the few staff that is already still around is just chasing, lawsuit to get that bank account, to get their money back. The Ethiopian Women Lawyers Association, which I myself was a member and was providing legal services, has now shut down most of its offices, and the headquarters is going to be closed very soon. 80% of its staff has been laid off. Its bank account has been frozen. So a combined $1 million US from these two local NGOs, independent NGOs, has been frozen. So I think where we are going is towards total authoritarianism in that country. The government in the recent 2010 election claimed that they won the election by 99.6%. How does the US government or the international community fund such an autocratic government that is repressive of, the human rights of its citizen? And I do not see that government being an ally in any counterterrorism effort, because they are doing that to cling into power, to remain. This government has been in power for the past 21 years. And only one prime minister until he died last year, he has been ruling the country with iron fist. So I think the international community can do a lot. The US government can do a lot to push this government to rescind this law, which is no amendment. I don't see any amendment can fix this law. It's too draconian. It's just an all-encompassing. They allowed foreign NGOs to give handouts, food, service delivery, but no right. In a country where the literacy rate stands at only, I think, from the CIA fact-based, fact book, I was just checking it this morning, it says it stands at 39% literacy rate. How do you ban voter education when the society is in dire need of civic education? I think the rest we can be discussing.
So let me give you a snapshot, and it's just a snapshot of what we are trying to do. And I will be presenting what is, in fact, a sliver of effort from the US government. At AID, we have missions around the world. As taxpayers, you should know that there are people on the ground every single day working these issues, and of course, embassies. Very specifically, President Obama was out speaking on this issue, and Mina was on a panel with him in September on the margins of the UN General Assembly. And we were essentially given a mandate over the next 12 months to be working inside the US government along a couple different lines. Number one, what more can we do to be thinking about the domestic political and policy environment? To what extent do we use or work through organizations like the Open Government Partnership to be able to draw attention to the situation around closing space in civil society? Do we have mechanisms when a law in South Sudan or Kenya is happening to make sure that our folks on the ground are engaging with other donors, other civil society partners? To the extent that we have a rapid response network, how well is it working? Two, what additional diplomacy and multilateral efforts can we develop? You mentioned the community of democracies. Are there ways to strengthen the multilateral efforts that are already going on so that we really step up our game? Three, we have an internal process that we're trying to engage in. I would say as part of that, or in response to that, we at AID have also introduced a new democracy, human rights, and governance strategy. I've been talking to all sorts of donors over the last couple of weeks about this strategy, and I was just in Sweden where we were with the CETA, who pioneered a human rights approach to development. And I will say to you that our strategy was hugely informed by CETA's approach, and that the approach that USAID is taking ultimately, Mina, you can judge us in the next 5 and 10 years, but it is to have inclusive development. It is to have a human rights frame affecting the larger development work. Fourth, and this is where I want to go one more round before we open it up to all of you, the fourth line of work is really to be thinking outside the box. What does it mean to have sustainability in the 21st century for civil society. Is it possible that the approach that we really developed in the 20th century of donors supporting civil society organizations, oftentimes donors from outside the country, is that, does that continue to be viable? Is it healthy? In certain places it's going to be necessary, but are there new and different approaches that we should be exploring? Does the internet, does the affordable information technology provide us the ability to raise funds in different kinds of ways? Are there new and different donors that we might be getting involved? Are there constituents that we have yet to reach? Is there peer-to-peer learning that we might engage in? We see the authoritarians doing a lot of lateral learning. What about for civil society? So it's this new and possibly different 21st century framework that I want to get your views on. Or do we have it about right and we should continue what we're doing? Why don't we go this way this time? And then you all be thinking about your questions. We'll be coming to you shortly.
I think it might be, country by country approach. In the case of Ethiopia, as I mentioned, this law and the other, catalog of laws that the government passed, like the anti-terrorism law, the mass media law, all in 2009, is to suppress dissent, is to suppress the freedom that citizens have to come together and associate, and not just the funding. The funding, the government is very happy to receive the funding because it created category of civil societies. For example, they call it Ethiopian resident charities. As long as they don't go to the no-go areas of human rights, voter education, they can receive the money because the government is in dear need of foreign currency. So they get the money through that, because one of the studies recently made by the donor assistant group in Ethiopia shows that the National Bank of Ethiopia said that there are no money lost through this process because they are getting it through other means. Now the government is even saying that in the future, like gender-based violence, legal rights, that should be done by government agents. They have already created parallel NGOs, what they call them. They are, along the party structure, along the ethnic-based, because the country is already divided into, it's just like an ethnic Bantustan. They have all regions around these ethnic groups, and people are organized through that, but they are all aligned to the party affiliation. So this law and the other laws are just created to decimate a vibrant civil society in the country. So if we continue like this, if this law continues to be operational, we're not going to see any independent civil society in that country. The result will be the government is going to continue to be in power. How can you have, as I said, when the literacy rate in the country is just 40%, there is no even spoiled ballot paper that the government can get 99.6% of the voter? I doubt it. So the assault is just on freedom of association, not the money. There are 1 million Ethiopians just here in the United States. If they could send $1, but this law even bans any money, no association can receive any money from outside Ethiopia. And the country is so poor, one of the poorest countries in the world. The government receives one of the major recipients of foreign aid. So, it just boggles the mind.
Yeah, just a little. I think as we now I'll be a little bit provocative, so please forgive me on this one. But I think if we're looking at 21st century ways of doing human rights work, I think perhaps we might even go a little bit beyond the 90s and go into the 60s and 70s in terms of how to look at it. And one of the things is that, as far as I'm concerned, and my report to the Human Rights Council this year was about funding for associations, which I think was pretty good report and looked at and made a case that funding is an integral part to freedom of association. But one of the things that strikes me is that the funding question is really one of the tools that are used by repressive governments simply to destroy and finish NGOs. So the game plan, the ultimate end, is to restrict and remove dissent where it might appear. That's really the ultimate aim. So if we then focus it on that, how can we then address our question? I think first of all, it might be good to look at this from the Cold War approach in terms of how did the West in the context of the Cold War work with civil society and those supporting democracy within the East, and how did they do that? So it wasn't a matter of giving funding and a big grant to associations and NGOs. I think there was a much more practical approach in which money was and funding was given to pursue the goals of democracy and human rights in different parts of the world. But I think part of it as well is I'm beginning to think now more and more that rather than do this annual fundraising approach where you write a proposal, you get a grant for 1 year, if you're lucky you get it for 3 years, and if you're really lucky you get it for 5 years. I think we've got to move away from that into more investment funding, so that the groups that you choose and you want to work with, that the groups that are focusing on values that you believe in, can actually get resources to create investments and then have much less reliance on foreign assistance. So because if you can take up and buy a building which you can rent out, you will have resources that can at least take care of the basics of the salaries and the rent and other things that are important in a human rights organization. So I think getting a shift away from annual fundraising and annual proposals, and then you have these quarterly reports. I think one of the fundamental things that's wrong is that the international community has taken the development paradigm and taken it as a template, bang, into human rights and democracy. And they want to see results. You're not distributing mosquito nets in human rights. You're trying to change attitudes. You cannot say within 3 months that we have done this change. You can say, yes, we have met 1,500 people, but whether they have gotten the message and are going to work with you is a totally different issue altogether. So I think we've got to move this from a short-term paradigm into long-term, which is why I am really, really opposed to this idea of results-based management, because results won't happen overnight. They will not happen overnight in human rights and democracy. You're talking about attitude change. You're talking about, as you've heard, people who are quite illiterate. Not that illiteracy means you don't understand human rights and democracy, but it gives you some fear when you're dealing with a state. So you've got to work through overcoming fear. And I think that's got to take a longer term approach in doing it. So let's move away from the development paradigm and go into another paradigm entirely. Thirdly, for me, I think the U.S. government here especially should consider moving from the 90s approach of funding U.S. private corporations to go and do human rights and democracy work in the South. That's become a big thing, and so money is channeled now from USAID to these corporations to do the work. I am not sure which corporation in the world would care about human rights and democracy. And I'm not sure, so their entire approach is results. Let's say, yes, we've done this because we've educated 1,500 people. That's the result. You tick it and you get more money from USAID. I think that's been a fundamental flaw in the way the US government has done it. And the second part of it is the consistent funding by the US, by US government to US NGOs to come in. Sometimes they do good work, but oftentimes they come and replace the domestic activists and take over that ground. And it does hurt. And I've seen it in a number of countries in the world where, I keep saying, if US is funding a US NGO to go to Central African Republic, that's fine, it makes sense because there's no civil society working there. But when you're doing that in South Africa or in Egypt or in Kenya, where there's a huge history and a strong history of human rights work and democracy work, you are actually weakening the groups that are on the ground. And then they become more and more competitive. So they stop focusing so much on the passion and the creation of the work, and focus on how do I get a proposal as good as X NGO so I can get money from these people. So it's actually making us worse. So in a sense, that's one of the biggest mistakes that's happened. The fourth thing I think in terms of a new approach is focusing a little bit more on the practicalities. And one of the things that we were doing in Kenya once this proposal of this NGO Act is we had a long discussion, we had long strategies planning about how we can fight the law. But then after that we began thinking, how do we survive? If this law is passed, how do we survive? And that's where now we began thinking about front loading of grants up front, how we began thinking about, well, maybe even for us we should start moving away and from calling ourselves a human rights organization and call ourselves a religious order for human rights, because religious groups are exempted from these laws. So we thought, okay, we'll have somebody there as the archbishop, then you have an ayatollah, and you have a grand rabbi, and everybody is there in position, so we can have religious organizations doing human rights, but really practical approaches to working. Thirdly, I think that there has to be much more investment and much more thinking about working with civil society that's trying to build constituencies. And one of the big mistakes we made, all of us, and I'm included in that, is that when we started human rights groups in the South in the 90s, we built them really on the model of Lawyers Committee for Human Rights or Human Rights Watch and other things. And I think that was a big mistake we made, because we were an elite group in the capital without any links on the ground. We were very happy because we had sense, we had rationale, we had the law, we had all these things. We were very articulate and very clear. But we had no grassroots support. And when we needed to do protests, we had to go to the churches, to politicians. And I think it's time now for the world to start thinking, how do we help build these groups to have grassroots support? There's nothing new. I mean, it's not rocket science. It just takes a lot of work. But the civil rights movement in this country was built from the bottom up. The women's rights movement is built from the bottom up. And when you look at the anti-apartheid movement in this country, came from the bottom up. And I think there are good examples in which can be done to move it forward. Finally, on what can be done in this new era, is really, I've had a number of discussions in Kenya about the recent election in 2013. And it's been praised by a lot of people. People said, yes, it was peaceful. And you think, it was calm. It was not peaceful. It was calm. And calm is not peace. And there's been a lot and there's a rush to say, fine, it's done and it's good, let's move ahead. But looking back now, 9 months later, we still haven't got the full official results of that election. A study has been done and there's 900,000 missing votes still. What you get? Utter silence about it. So we accept calm because we're so interested in stability, not knowing that the calm only postpones the problem, only postpones it. And I can tell you, when it comes back the next time, it will be far worse. So of course the regime has a chance, when there's calm, if it's willing to do so, to start working and building and reducing the tensions that are there. But when you have a regime of people who are indicted by the International Criminal Court, you can have absolutely no doubt in your mind that they will not expand space, they'll close it down. And so it's been fascinating me meeting up with international community, and they tell me that, well, we gave Kenyatta and Ruto benefit of the doubt. And I'm thinking, which world are they on? These guys are indicted by the International Criminal Court. How can you give them benefit of doubt? To do what? They've been very clear. And so this whole approach of stability, let's work with what's there, is incredibly demeaning to people in the South. It's incredibly demeaning to people who are working on this issue. So I would like to throw a challenge out to the Americans out here to please hold your government accountable. Push them a little bit more, because sometimes they take the easy way out. And the easy way, actually, when you've got the president and the vice both indicted by ICC, is to let's just keep it there, because the option of saying we don't support them and we're going against them is really a hard one, absolutely. So we take the easy approach, and we shouldn't take the easy approach for human rights. It's never been easy. I mean, I think this country itself knows how hard it was to come to where it is and pass the amendments and pass the Constitution and get to where it is now.
So, Mina, you've given us a lot of very provocative things. I want to highlight that there's a fabulous panel this afternoon called Dreaming Forward. What do today's young activists learn from the U.S. civil rights movement? For my colleagues who will still be here, please take great notes to share with me. I will go back to some of your comments before opening up, but I want to hear from Nadine on 21st century new approaches, responding to Mina in any way.
Yeah, I think we need to rethink collective action. I think what the issue is, we look at donor-recipient relationships as a donor and a recipient. I am not a recipient. I have certain targets, and if your targets match mine, if your goals match mine, then we're happy to work together. I don't see a donor as someone who supports me. I see a donor as someone who works for me and has a specific way of working. They have a specific mandate, and that is how they help the human rights movement. Now, taking that across, also, we need to start looking at stakeholders and not organizations. Who are the stakeholders? You have organizations, human rights organizations that do analysis and legal analysis and do litigation. That's very important. We also have grassroots organizations. Organizations that do analysis and legal analysis are very academic, very intellectual. They're not the kind of organizations that are going to be able to do the grassroots work. But you need both in any community to be able to sustain a movement. So we need to look at movements. And what has worked are organizations that have worked, or at least what have worked on the ground, are organizations that have worked together. You have NGO organizations, human rights organizations, the NGO Forum in Egypt, that have worked together to create certain change and work closely with organizations that are not NGOs, like No to Military Trials, like Military Liars, like the collective movements that you have, collective actions on the ground. These are very, very important components and need to be viewed when looking at a strategy. One of the important issues is donors, or one of the stakeholders, donors, look as the recipients, as NGOs, and not look at the entire movement. So I think all of these organizations, all of these stakeholders need to come to the table and create a collective strategy. And that's the way you're going to have a shift. We need a huge paradigm shift on how the human rights community views itself. We are not all separate parts. We really are a global community. And another issue I feel is the idea of globalization. I think that globalization sets us up in a framework where there are multinational organizations, whether you're talking corporations, whether you're talking human rights organizations, whether you're talking about the UN and governments that have or view themselves as donors to other countries are at the top, and then everyone else comes down underneath. I think rethinking another saying, think globally and act locally, is very, very important. We need to come together and think on a global level. How is this shift going to happen? What are the mechanisms, not only looking at the UN, but looking at the plethora of tactics. I look at the UN as one of the tactics, the African Commission as another, and different areas where we can push. Sometimes the best push comes from a local embassy on the ground versus going to a special rapporteur and submitting, creating a submission of a violation. So it's, I guess the closing is that one size does not fit all. We all belong, and we all need to find how are we going to help. We need to see what are our areas of support and how we can support each other in doing that work. Stop working in silos. Development organizations need to think of themselves as human rights organizations, and human rights organizations need to think of themselves as development organizations. You do training, you do work, you do it as part of moving a society forward. So looking at a network for donors and non-organizations, seeing where you can support without creating security risks, without creating issues, and looking at some of the human rights organizations and some of the development organizations and seeing where is the best place you can work. So I think this is a time for us to all come together and think holistically, what can we do, but how can we create collective action?
We're going to go to Q&A. Let me just say on the security risks, several of us were at a meeting at a place, I won't get into details, about 2 weeks ago, over 50 activists focused on physical and cybersecurity, that the risks to all sorts of human rights defenders have increased exponentially over the last 10 years, and that donors are not asking enough questions about it and not supporting enough work on this, but also recognizing that there's, in some organizations, a kind of martyr culture, that people don't want to get trained on these issues, and that's putting people at risk, but also the concept of sort of holistic security, that maybe donors are supporting a very nice office, and then at night people are going home to very dangerous situations whether they're working on LGBTI or what have you. So really sort of pushing us to think outside the box on these issues. Mina, you'd be happy to know that as an agency, we are committed to increasing our support to local organizations. From the administrator on down, there's, I think, perhaps no one who'd be more enthusiastic to not be supporting contractors. Sometimes it gets them into trouble. So we are stretching ourselves. So can I see some hands of Q and A? Let's start with the ambassador, and then I see, okay, great. I'm going to take a little list. Is there a mic? Yeah.
Thanks.
Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Eileen Donahoe. I was the ambassador to the UN Human Rights Council for the United States until October. It's wonderful to see Mina and Sarah. Hi. I wanted to ask a question about the Internet's function for human rights defenders, information communication technology generally, and digital networks. Do you see this technology as basically net positive for human rights defenders, or do you feel more that governments are ahead of the curve in knowing how to use technology to squelch free speech, freedom of assembly and association, and censorship, filtering, intimidation, et cetera? Which way do you see it?
Great question. Let's take a few more, and then we're going to go around. Excellent question. Right here. Then we'll go to the-
Thank you. Kay Gadan, Charity and Security Network. I wanted to ask your comments on some things that the U.S. can do to lead by example in terms of removing barriers and restrictions on civil society. In the U.S., counterterrorism laws prohibit peace-building groups from engaging with groups on the prescribed lists. Grantees for USAID and State Department funds are being asked to submit very detailed personal information to the U.S. government intelligence database for screening, surveillance, and barriers to humanitarian assistance in places like Somalia during the famine. And what can the U.S. do to help address these issues and lead by example?
Gentleman in the back. No, sorry. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Luis. I'm with the Lesbian Victoria Institute. I wanted to bring attention to the panelists and let's see what do they think about it. It's like we are missing maybe here, and I would love as well to have someone from the trade, from the Department of Commerce, Department of Defense, because at the end of the day, most of the human rights policies of the countries are shaped by trade. So how do you think we can finally bridge this gap and to put together like the trade of every government with human rights? And
So we cheated by having the person who worked on the human rights policy at USAID to be on the panel. Let's go this way first, and then we'll try and keep responses brief so that we can get more Q&A.
Okay.
Three big ones. You choose what you want to respond to.
So I'm going to combine the Department of Commerce and the net question because I think they're to me interlinked. So yes, the net is definitely a net positive. Governments are institutions and cannot function as quickly as some of the young activists. When a government puts up a wall on the net, you find activists finding workarounds. The government took down the internet, and you had Twitter come up with a solution where you call in your tweets. So it's almost impossible for governments to control, and I think this is why you're having the buildup of revolutionary movements or change, and very effective change because of the net and the interconnectivity that happens. It's a tool, it's not the action in itself, so you need to reflect it with actions on the ground, but because of that, and you can just have one source and it sort of spreads virally, it is a net positive. We need to be careful, which is where the Department of Commerce, my understanding, you need to be careful about some of the trade agreements. I'm not very versed on internet governance, but my understanding is that there are some closing of the space, not just internally or isolating between governments, between between areas, between issues, or for security, for counterterrorism reasons again. So this is an area where there does need to be some attention, and that's where the Chamber of Commerce can come in, or some other departments, and ensuring that this space continues to be open. Because in areas, as you'd mentioned earlier, where public space is closing, what happens is it just balloons online, and there are always ways to come in. So in making sure that human rights defenders in all communities are interconnected, and raising computer literacy in some of the less developed countries is a great way of forwarding the human rights mission.
Net positive.
Yeah, I think
laws.
I think in general ICT is a good thing, but I think it's also you also got to be clear that it can be a negative one, and I think I'm a victim of that myself. I write a column in the Kenyan newspaper every week, and it comes on the internet. And there was a time when each time I wrote something, I would get 40, 50 comments really insulting me, and I just didn't know where they're coming from because it's anonymous. But then we also then decided we then discovered that was actually one or two people who were spreading the same thing using different. So even repressive states know how to be able to use these spaces. So we now created our own network that also now comments. So actually for the last 1 month, I've had such positive feedback on my columns. I think I'm a very good writer, but but I think it's also a way to, I mean, you can always challenge it, which is a good thing about it. So I think it's good. I think the Department of Commerce and Defense is such an important issue for us. And I think for all of us here is the link, and that also applies, and I think you said this about linking all these channels together. Human rights groups must not just be simply human rights groups. They must talk and link up with humanitarian groups and development groups and with business sector. And the same thing applies for the government level, that oftentimes trade or defense or the war against terror are so important that they supersede everything else. And we've got to find a way in which human rights and governance and democracy is at the same level of importance. When it's seen and noted by repressive governments that it's not as important as stability, as stability or defense and security, then they do whatever they want. So I think that question is an important one. And coming through to the surveillance and what the U.S. government insists on, I think human rights groups and NGOs must always be accountable. I mean, I think the fact that we do this work does not mean we should not be accountable and transparent if we can. I mean, some places you cannot be transparent because it's so much of a risk. But I think that perhaps sometimes the laws for accountability go overboard, and when they start coming into your private space, I think there's an issue there. But I just wish that U.S. government or other governments would have the same level of inquisition for civil society as they have for private business. So when a bank or an organization wants to open up in Somalia or in Ethiopia, it really should be questioned the same way as a civil society organization. I think that's, for me, is a critical part, because when you look at the flows of funding and money on issue of terror, much of that money doesn't come through NGOs. It comes through private businesses. It's small little shop or small little bank or small little thing that goes there. And there's really very little scrutiny that's pushed there. So we've turned the world away and said private business is the most important thing. You have an open space, you can do anything you want to do. But the day you go into human rights or development or as an NGO, there's much more scrutiny. So accountability must spread across everybody, and I think that's important. But it must spread equally across other things. I hope I've answered your question.
Let me just say a positive word about my colleagues in Treasury, who, one of the most interesting places that is doing work on human rights is actually in Treasury, where they've developed all sorts of tools to be able to, especially in things like mass atrocities, target and find funding and people. So it's not just at places like USAID or the State Department or the White House that people are thinking about these things. So, internet net positive, how relevant is this for Ethiopia? U.S. laws and our colleagues at other agencies?
I mean, generally, there's no access to internet. It's very, very low rate. I think 1%. I'm not sure about the exact number, but it's very, very low access. Even Somalia has more access than Ethiopia. So in the internet aspect, people will learn still in Ethiopia, as my friend suggested, young people are using Facebook in Ethiopia. You know, internet is a very good tool. They are hearing about what is happening in the rest of the world. So there is a lot of advantage in that.
I mean, you have to wonder if this regime is able to sustain itself once internet penetration happens. I mean, there are theories out there that democratization and political transition in the 21st century is going to be driven on some level by access. There have been very patient people over there. If we can get a microphone, and there, and this side of the room seems quiet. Okay, good. So we're going to go one more round.
My name is Rada Al Fardan. I'm from Bahrain, member of Bahrain Watch. And I come from a region, the Middle East, that has benefited quite significantly from the international network of human rights organizations and human rights work, which wouldn't have existed the way it was without the donor funding that it had, and from governments all around. However, we have a big problem, especially in a situation where you have conflict between people, divisions within society. It is a culture, an atmosphere of fear from the outside. We have a closed-minded mentality because of the security situation. So one of the things, for example, that came up from Egypt was a lot of the NGOs, which were Egyptians, but they were being funded by outside governments, including the US. They got a problem where a lot of their good work, the value of it, didn't reach sections of society that were the average person on the street because of that funding. So what I'm wondering, my question is basically, is this being considered? Where is there a possibility to create a structure where the mistrust of having direct funding from an exact government can be solved by, for example, having a UN-type pool of donations from different governments supervised by respectable NGOs so that people around the world, especially in these areas, will kind of have a bit more trust that these people are not foreign agents as have they been described, for example, in Russia.
Thank you. Very pertinent question. We'll look forward to hearing our panelists answer. We have a person here.
Hi, I'm Sarah Prey. I work for the Open Society Foundations, an advocate focused mostly on Africa. Nadine, in your opening comments, you mentioned what I think is kind of the biggest issue of the day, which is this move towards counterterrorism as the paradigm for looking at human rights. And it goes to Mina's point about why we don't have consistency in our approach to different countries, whether they're a strategic partner or not is sort of the first question, and then we get to all the others. So I wanted to ask a couple questions. As we see sort of an increased militarization of our aid, that means more money is being funneled through the Department of Defense, and the Department of Defense does not have the same relationship with civil society that the State Department does. So it's going to be harder and harder for civil society.
Or AID.
Yes, sorry. Of course, that's a given, Sarah. That's a given. So that poses a challenge both for advocates working on the ground, but also those of us in D.C. You know, it's not enough just to say that the assistance is being vetted, you know, the Leahy laws. That shouldn't be the end of the conversation, right? And I feel so often that that's what happens. As long as there's incredible evidence of gross violations of human rights, then, you know, we're in the clear. Well, no, because we're not getting to Nadine's point about the huge macro questions. So I'm wondering if you all could comment on your advice for those of us working in DC on this issue and what you are hearing from civil society groups on this particular issue of the sort of increased militarization and, you know, how do we combat that?
One more.
I gotta say she stole my question, but it was great. Thank you so much. You articulated it in a great way. I had the same, I echo your concerns. But since that question was asked, I'll jump to another one. I also am curious, it was a little bit, I think, of Nadine said, and somebody else said too, about the collective. So working in a collective action and not so much focus on the NGO, because I think what's happening is there is that response on the ground. We already know that, you know, it's not that, oh, let's think about that. It's already happening. But I think donors, governments, and other bigger NGOs, like the big ones in all the countries, haven't gotten there yet in terms of policies and things like that. So what do we do when it's not a legal NGO? It's not registered. When there are networks of activists or networks of people that we may not traditionally think as defenders, like mothers searching for their disappeared children in Mexico or through Central America. Where are donors taking that into consideration? How are they funding them if they're not through legal channels in terms of legal registration? You have an official bank account with the name of the organization, et cetera, especially as governments start passing these laws that heavily restrict NGOs.
Just a point of policy, it is the policy of the United States to support NGOs even in cases where a domestic law is not in conformity with international standards. It is also a huge focus for us thinking in terms of informal networks or movements and how we move away a bit from the formal NGO and supporting it. It's obviously an easier thing to do, and ideally, you want to have an organization that has a professional staff, et cetera, so it has some sense of longevity. But this question of the larger collective action, I think, is very salient. So informal movements, militarization, and if I can, in some ways, your question about a new paradigm, new ways of supporting, links back to this issue of broadening constituencies. I'm very interested to hear your views on this. Where do you want to start, Nadine?
Okay. I think that the issue of foreign funding is a huge issue in Egypt. We're currently in the process of writing a new NGO law, and this is the foreign organizations and foreign funding keeps going back and forth. I just want to point out it's actually not an issue of foreign funding. It's an issue of trying to silence public space and a tactic to be able to silence that. So even if you find a solution, they're going to continue to call you. Most of the people who are accused of foreign funding are activists who don't get foreign funding. Do you know what I mean? So the accusation doesn't link up to the facts on the ground, and they don't need facts on the ground. So while I agree that's an issue, there are other mechanisms, but this will go into how your strategy is on the ground. One of the issues with the counterterrorism strategy for me, or paradigm, is that you have a thinking, or at least that's what I've heard from friends of mine who work with the military, is the idea that working in counterterrorism on the ground means building schools, and so the military now is shifting to do some of the development work. How are you doing that? And still this is part of your counterterrorism strategy. Well, the military is no longer doing its work, and it's doing work where it's not specialized at. So that is the problem, is you're siloing some of this work, looking at when we're doing counterterrorism, they can do development work. Well, I think that this all needs to be brought into the table, and you need to remove the human rights paradigm. We need to stop talking about human rights. We need to stop talking about counterterrorism and look at a more holistic approach to it. How are we creating stability? What does stability actually mean? And build from that. And I think human rights is an important part of that, because if the military has come to the point that building schools and building hospitals is an important part of their counterterrorism work, that means that human rights is an important part. The very basic human rights is an important part of that. And going back to collective action, I think you need to be careful not to burden movements with some of the work that's necessary for organizations, but making sure that this is also part of your strategy, which is why we all need to sit down and rethink it. Because if you asked me, as part of my movement, some of the movements I've worked with on the ground, to put a report to a donor, I actually wouldn't take the money. I wouldn't even think about taking the money. I would never want to talk to you. Talking to a donor as a movement is very, very problematic. But having organizations like the Cairo Institute, like the Egyptian Initiative, like the Hisham Mubarak Center, who are institutions, some taking money and some not. I'm not saying that, but having them support us and being able to support the lawyers who come out and pull us out of jail and do all of this stuff is very, very important. So you need to see the small bits for them as part of a greater picture, and stop looking at the panacea that's going to fix the situation. Each person needs to do their part, and it includes the U.S. government, from the embassy staffer that meets us, to the ambassador, to making sure that Geneva and all of this is interconnectedness. So this is the approach that's worked, and actually on the ground in Egypt, that's the approach that's worked so far at pushing back on the NGO law, is making sure you had grassroots work, you had international work, you had international work locally, international work internationally, and of course working with the UN and multinational institutions and mechanisms. So this is all part of how you work, and none of that can be taken out, because once you pull out one of this, that becomes the weakest link and your entire thing falls apart, which I'd like to point out is what happened with the assembly law. We took our eye off the ball. International, some of the international actors moved slightly away because we believed that it wasn't going to happen, and you know what, it passed. And we keep our eye on the ball with the NGO law, and we keep pushing back on Egypt. And this is a collective action across the board, from local to international actors, and we're still being able to get some traction and moving that forward.
I mean, a healthy investment portfolio always has diversified funding streams.
And that's what I was going to say as well in terms of funding. I think for even for any country, just putting all your eggs in one basket is never a smart move. And I think for civil society as well, expanding and diversifying your source of funding is always good. I just wanted to say something about the non-registration. I think the international norms that I'm trying to push as UN Special Rapporteur is it doesn't matter whether an organization is registered or not. An association is an association. Now it's up to the people, the partners you have, whether they trust you or not, if they can give you money to work directly. And that's a matter of building trust and building partnerships. And I think just to touch on the war on terrorism and what the Department of Defense is doing, you know, I think one of the smartest things that the U.S. government ever did was the Peace Corps, and it really helped change people's perception or give people's perception of America in a very different way. I had my first music teacher was a Peace Corps volunteer, and as many of us who are in the South were taught by Peace Corps volunteers, and it's a wonderful way to link up to the United States. And it's something that even as you're doing the work on the war on terror, just that personal linkage with people who are coming into your village in a sense and living like you and living with and having to take cold showers is thoroughly important in very many ways. And if that's the way, if the U.S. could actually expand, if the U.S. wants to expand its influence, rather than going to send soldiers to build schools, I think just send more Peace Corps volunteers. Actually, it actually might be even much easier. And let them be teachers. Let them do the small little nitty-gritty work. And it's way cheaper anyway for the U.S. since these guys get almost next to nothing when they're out there. So it just was. I mean, because I've seen this in the context of Kenyan Coast and the military coming to do and trying to pass this vaccination campaigns in the coast. People just run because it's a soldier. You know, they just run. It won't work. They just got to have a much more smarter way of doing things. And I think that's hopefully the 21st century way of doing things will be. Some of it is actually goes back to the Cold War in very many ways. Yeah.
Peace Corps founded by President Kennedy, being fundamentally coming from a Cold War
Perspective,
soft power approach. So you've got perhaps the last word.
Okay. So the new law is designed to wipe out independent civil society from the country, and the donor pool someone was mentioning. I think there is a research already by the European donors, collectively tracking the trend and the impact of the civil society already in Ethiopia. Their research found that now the government is more and more talking to the donors rather than the local civil society organization. That will completely disenfranchise the people who have a voting right in the country, because now the government is trying to alienate locals. So it's much better to push and work with the locals than just being end up like donors actually taking over and implementing the work in the country.
We've had a provocative session. I think we've touched on some of the most important questions before civil society and governments in the 21st century. I don't know that we've resolved them. I hope that some of these continue as golden threads through the rest of the 2 days, and I hope to be back with you at different times. Please join me in thanking these panelists for their time, their courage, and their work.